Hi friends, my name is Sarah, and I'm currently the Intentional Interim Minister with St. Andrew's United Church in Lacombe, Alberta. If you're watching this video, it means that you received the link via the email letter that I sent out to the St. Andrew's Community of Faith. Or you might have found it via our Facebook page or even this channel itself. No matter what brought you here, welcome. My husband John has graciously shared his YouTube channel, The Accessible Faith Project, with us during this time of pandemic as a place to share my weekly reflections. There are other videos on this channel which are an opportunity to learn more about the Bible, faith questions, and the like. And if you'd like to receive notifications of when new videos are posted, you can do so by clicking on the little bell icon that says subscribe and signing up. It's completely free. If I were to begin this reflection with the words, once upon a time, or long ago and far away, or even in the beginning, most of us would realize that a story is starting. There is something about a story that draws us in. Those of us who are bookworms speak of getting lost in a story. I think, though, that what draws each of us into stories, whether we are very young or advancing in years or somewhere in between, is the promise of finding within the story, of finding a different world, of finding a different time, of finding God, of finding ourselves. There is something in each of us that hungers for a story. When we read a story, when we hear a story, we enter into it. And sometimes we connect with a particular character, almost becoming one with them as the tale unfolds. And when the story comes to an end and we are returned to ourselves, perhaps we are a bit different for having read or heard the story, having learned something from it about the world or about ourselves. The author of Psalm 78, I think, knew the power of telling a story and how important and how absolutely critical that is. They understood that we cannot know God without stories, that we cannot know ourselves without them. The psalmist knows that we cannot be the people of God without telling the story of God, passing the story on to each generation. As author James Taylor paraphrases this psalm, we belong to a long line of travelers, snaking in a single file through history. We bear with us the beliefs, the convictions, the experiences bequeathed to us by those who passed this way before. From Abraham and Sarah, from Rachel and Jacob, from David and Bathsheba, from Mary and Jesus, we learn our faith story. Only by knowing where we have come from can we know where we are going. Only by knowing who and whose we are can we know that God is with us. Why was it so important to the psalmist that we tell the stories of our faith? Well, perhaps that has to do with when this particular psalm was written, as some scholars believe that it was composed at the time of the divided kingdom, perhaps after the northern kingdom had been taken away into Israel. The references it makes to Ephraim, the major tribe in the north, and to the fall of the shrine at Shiloh, all point to this psalm having been written there and then. The northern tribes were taken away from everything that they knew and were dwelling in a foreign land. And many thought in this time that God had forgotten them, while many others forgot about God and so drifted away to worshiping the idols of their captors. And so the psalmist writes to them these words of remembrance, words for a nation divided and in danger of forgetting the God in whom they said they trusted. They are called to tell and to retell the story, not only to help them remember where they have come from, but also to know that God is with them and that God will continue with them into the future. When Jesus came in the fullness of time, as the story goes, he came as the Word made flesh, a story in motion. And he went into the world with stories on his lips, weaving them everywhere he went. A sower went out to sow. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers. There was a man who had 2 sons. Jesus understood that in a world where it can be so difficult to know God, to know others, to know even ourselves, that a story can offer a language, a doorway, a point of entry. Jesus knew how a story can take us a little deeper into knowing, a little farther down the road in our journey of return. We will not hide the story from our children, the psalmist writes in Psalm 78. And perhaps that's where the power of a good story lies. That it unhides something, that it reveals something, and someone with a capital S, someone that we need to know. The call of the psalmist to the divided kingdom of Israel to remember their stories, to tell their stories of how they connect to God and to one another again and again to the next generation until those stories become their own, is applicable to us as well. We too need to tell our stories, to tell our personal stories, to tell our faith stories, to tell the story of this community of faith to the generations that follow. One story we often have is about pictures, and it's said that a picture can speak 1,000 words, and I believe that's true. The things that we choose to take photos of often have stories attached to them, a reason that we took the photo in the first place. And these days, with the advent of technology, we take far more pictures of everyday things, and we don't often print them unless they have a great deal of significance to them and to us. And so the photos that we do have in non-digital formats are that much more remarkable, more special, and more important. One of the favorite pictures that I have of my mother is from when she was just a small girl, taken by her dad, my grandfather. And this picture is remarkable in 2 ways. First, it was taken at a time when film was very expensive, and only about 8 pictures were able to be captured on each roll of film. It was costly to have the photos developed and printed as well, and so there aren't a lot of printed pictures of my parents when they were little children. And the second reason that I think my favorite photo of my mother is significant is because she was small enough. She was just over 3 years old and about 3 feet in height. She actually doesn't remember the picture being taken, nor why the picture was taken. Now, you might be wondering why this particular photo is important to me and why I'm sharing about it with you today. And that is because in this photograph, my mother is holding a newspaper that is almost as big as she was at 3 years old. And it is clear, even though she is smiling, that it's hard for her to be holding so big a newspaper up so that her dad could take the picture. It's also obvious that the little girl in this photograph isn't old enough to read, let alone to understand the headline of what the newspaper says. By now, you might have guessed the headline of that particular newspaper that she was holding. It declared that the Second World War was over. My grandfather served in the Canadian Armed Forces as a firefighter, and while he was never posted overseas and he rarely talked about his experiences of being a military man, I think he wanted to capture the enormity of the event that had happened in my mother's lifetime, an event that she wouldn't remember for herself, hence why he took the photograph. And it is because of his service and others like my grandfather that my mother's generation, the war babies and the baby boomers, that my generation, the Gen Xers and those who follow, we have not known World War. We look at photos and we choose to remember the stories that they tell, the tales that our veterans have shared, and we remember. We remember and we continue to work together for a world that is at peace. Our stories matter. The act of reading them, the act of telling them. Our stories help us to better understand our world and ourselves and the things that we are called to do. For within each one of them is a bigger story still. The story of God's love and of God's grace, which has no beginning and no end. May our words and our very lives continue to tell the story. Thanks be to God. Amen.